Daniel has always been a journalist driven by the incessant search for the truth. His job was to investigate subjects that many people preferred to ignore, always on the lookout for something hidden, a secret ready to be revealed. So when he received an anonymous email with information about a secret scientific project, something told him that he was about to encounter one of the greatest mysteries of his career. The sender didn't provide much, but enough to pique his curiosity: a hidden laboratory, far from the public eye, where illegal experiments were being conducted. What intrigued him most, however, was the name of the project: Healing Through Chaos. At first, Daniel thought it was just another unfounded conspiracy. However, after months of investigating and gathering information, he discovered that the message wasn't as absurd as it seemed. The clue led him to a remote town where a medical scientific research center was operating without government oversight. What was initially presented as a center for the development of new medicines was, in reality, involved in something much darker: the reactivation of old viruses and the genetic manipulation of human beings. The facility was surrounded by high walls and security cameras, with restricted access even for the researchers working there. Daniel used his experience to infiltrate, creating a false identity and starting to ask questions among the more unsuspecting employees and scientists. Little by little, he gained access to the lower floors, where the most secret projects were kept. On one of these floors, he found confidential documents which, when read in full, revealed something terrifying. The scientists weren't just trying to cure diseases. They were creating new forms of viruses, genetically modified viruses, with the potential to be more lethal than anything ever seen before. As Daniel rummaged through more and more files, a frightening truth unfolded before him. The lab wasn't just looking for cures. It was actually developing pathogens with the intention of controlling them. Some of these viruses had been chosen because of their ability to resist modern treatments. Others, even more disturbing, were designed to evolve rapidly, becoming resistant to any attempt at eradication. Scientists believed that by reversing the mutations of past diseases, they could improve them, offering a definitive cure, but the price of this experiment was incalculable. The threat of a global outbreak was becoming more and more real. It was then that he realized the worst. The creation of these biological weapons wasn't just about treating diseases. There was a bigger, darker plan. Some scientists, blinded by greed and a thirst for power, believed they could manipulate human evolution through these mutations. The line between cure and destruction was becoming increasingly blurred. But in trying to alert the press to what he had discovered, Daniel found himself caught up in a dangerous game. His investigation did not go unnoticed. Someone inside the lab had gotten wind of his actions, and he soon found himself being closely monitored. One night, while trying to escape, a mysterious figure confronted him in the cold corridors of the lab. There was no more time to hesitate. He knew that if he continued his investigation, he could put not only his life at risk, but the lives of millions. The threat of being silenced became more real than ever, and Daniel, now marked by those who knew too much, had to flee without a trace, taking with him the only evidence that could open the world's eyes to the horrors taking place behind the closed doors of that laboratory. As Daniel disappeared into the shadows, tension began to take over his mind. He knew that his discoveries were much more than he could process at once. The world, as he knew it, was about to change forever. The threat of the genetic virus that was now out of control seemed imminent. But what Daniel didn't know was that his every move was being closely monitored. The experiment had only just begun. Daniel found himself in an existential dilemma. Now, far from the lab and with evidence in hand, he was no longer sure how to proceed. What he had discovered was devastating. If the public became aware that an experiment like this was being conducted, the consequences would be irreversible. The problem, however, was that when he tried to alert the authorities, he encountered closed doors. Everyone seemed to be involved in some way, and no one wanted to listen. The scope of the project was wider than he had imagined. It wasn't just a clandestine laboratory, but an international network of scientists funded by powerful corporations, with enough influence to silence anyone who dared to question their intentions. While desperately trying to find a way to spread the information, Daniel realized that the disease the lab was trying to create was no mere experiment. It was a new type of virus, designed to survive the most modern forms of treatment and immunization. Based on the remains of ancient viruses, such as the Black Death and the Spanish flu, the virus was reconfigured to be resistant to vaccines and antibiotics, something that should never be allowed. The project scientists were convinced that by manipulating the genetics of these pathogens, they could create a cure for the world's most lethal diseases. But Daniel soon realized that they were creating something much worse. They were actually creating the next great pandemic. The laboratory had developed a virus that not only spread quickly, but was also capable of mutating just as quickly. This virus would be immune to any kind of control, always evolving, adapting to new ways of fighting. In essence, the project sought absolute control over human life. What the scientists didn't foresee was the risk of an uncontrollable epidemic, which would escape their grasp and take on global proportions. The first samples, manipulated to test its effectiveness, had been released without any supervision, and the virus began to spread silently through areas that were difficult to monitor. The world was about to witness a new era of disease, but this time the culprits would not be natural viruses, but man's own creation. Meanwhile, Daniel tried to warn those who could still prevent the disaster, but was met with resistance at every level. He soon realized that, in order to survive, he would have to uncover the truth on his own, without waiting for help from others. But time was running out. The virus was already on the move. The world was already beginning to feel the effects of the virus. Local epidemics, initially ignored, began to spread. But no one knew that the real danger was just beginning. What seemed like a simple genetic mutation had become a global threat. And for Daniel, the risk of a catastrophe was closer than he had imagined. The world was in chaos. The first infections began to appear in isolated areas, but soon spread to large urban centers. The virus, a hybrid creation of ancient and modified genetic organisms, seemed to have a life of its own. It didn't just follow the natural routines of evolution. It evolved in real time, with impressive speed. What the scientists in the laboratory had predicted as a highly lethal virus was now proving to be even more treacherous. Its effects did not manifest themselves immediately, which allowed those infected to circulate for days before showing symptoms. This made any attempt at containment virtually impossible. Even more shocking, the virus proved immune to all known treatments, a nightmare for doctors and specialists. Daniel, now on the run, watched in horror as the institutions he had once believed to be unbreakable disintegrated. He had done what he could to alert the world. He had published the leaked documents, created videos, brought the information to networks of journalists and independent organizations. But as the panic spread, the very concept of truth began to distort. Social networks were saturated with conspiracy theories, and global authorities were so overwhelmed trying to control the outbreak that any attempt to communicate about the origin of the virus was quickly stifled. Fear and misinformation became the most valuable currency, and the truth lost its value. Daniel now found himself in a situation where there were no longer any heroes or villains. The war against the virus was being fought on two fronts: a public one, with governments trying to implement quarantines and distribute vaccines, and a secret one, where powerful organizations were trying to control the truth and manipulate events for their own interests. He finally realized that the same scientists who had created the virus were somehow becoming the centerpieces of a new world power. Those who had wanted to control human biology were now ready to rule over the ruins of the old world. But the most surprising thing of all happened when Daniel discovered something he could never have imagined. The project he had uncovered was not, in fact, a mistake or a lost experiment. In fact, it was part of a global plan, masterminded by a secret network of scientific, political, and business elites who already knew what was coming. The virus was never intended to save humanity. Its purpose was always to provoke a global social and political reconfiguration. The creation of the virus was just the first step towards what they called the New Order. The virus, which seemed to be out of control, had actually been designed to create a new power dynamic. The elites knew that ancient diseases would be the key to undermining the stability of the world, but at the same time, by controlling the cure, they could take full command. Chaos was just a tool. What looked like an uncontrolled tragedy was actually a meticulously planned strategy. Daniel was now faced with an impossible choice. With the truth exposed, he could no longer expect the world to reverse the situation. The pandemic, which he had initially believed to be the end, now seemed to be just the beginning. Large corporations were buying up land, resources, and power, while failed governments were trying unsuccessfully to fight the spread of the virus. Humanity was dividing into those who succumbed to panic and those who saw it as an opportunity to consolidate their dominance. But the most terrifying thing was yet to come. Daniel discovered that the virus wasn't the only experiment. In secret places, more viruses were being developed, more powerful and more adaptable. What he thought was a fight for the survival of a threatened world was actually just one phase of the plan for a new world order. And now, those who had control over the virus were also the holders of the future. Daniel, exhausted and aware that his fate was already sealed, did the only thing he could do. He went into hiding. There was no more room for a hero. There was no more audience for a big scandal. He was alone. The truth, as terrible as it might be, would no longer make a difference. Power had already been seized, and the future would be decided by those who controlled biotechnology. Governments and ordinary people were now at the mercy of an invisible and ruthless system. The last scene is revealing and disturbing. A live broadcast, initiated by an unknown figure, announces the creation of a new global system of governance based on biotechnology, where only those who survive the pandemic will have a place in the new world. Daniel, watching from his hiding place, realizes that humanity will never be the same again. Control is no longer in the hands of governments or the masses. Control is in the hands of those who, in the shadows, have written the rules of the future. Share your opinion in the comments, and tell us if you believe these forbidden experiments exist. If you like this story and want to explore more stories like it, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. The unknown still has a lot to teach us.